High risk start sits for week 11. We are looking specifically at flex plays and streaming options this week and whether or not you can trust these risky players in your fantasy lineup. As always, drop your start sit questions in the comments below and I will answer them. Now let's go ahead and dive right in because I have got some very interesting streaming options this week. Jameis Winston is officially the Giants starter for week 11, but is he worthy of being a starter in your fantasy lineup? We know Winston pretty well at this point. We know exactly what to expect, but let's look at Winston's 2024 numbers in Cleveland to assess if he's a viable streaming option this week. Winston obviously has his highs and his lows. His floor in 2024 was literally a 2-point fantasy point performance against Kansas City, while his ceiling was 35 fantasy points against Denver. Winston literally has the ability to sink your week or single-handedly win it. He is the purest definition of a risky start-sit quarterback with the potential to finish as the overall QB1 or somehow manage to finish outside of the top 32, even with multiple teams on a bye. Now, this discussion would be a lot easier if we had a more moderate defensive matchup, but the Giants face the Green Bay Packers this week. The Packers defense has had its own highs and lows, but it isn't completely impenetrable. Recency bias has us remembering Jalen Hurts' 12-point fantasy performance last week against Green Bay. However, Jacoby Brissett, Joe Flacco, and Dak Prescott all had very strong performances against them. Winston's weapons are a bit depleted, unfortunately. We have no issue starting Jackson Dart because despite the underwhelming supporting cast, he has that rushing upside. Now, Winston will have to rely on Wan'Dale Robinson, Theo Johnson, and Darius Slayton, hopefully there, with several borderline QB1s in bad matchups or underperforming. Now, Winston, despite all of the things that are working against him here, he is still a very interesting streaming option this week. Risky, but incredibly high upside play. He will be in my top 20 this week. Now, Xavier Worthy as a streaming option is the exact opposite of Jameis Winston. He doesn't have the highs at all. His recent production has been very underwhelming, and the underperforming production could be tied directly to the return of Rashee Rice. However, his production has been disappointing even before Rice's return, and 2025 as a whole has been a struggle for him. Now, excluding that first game of the season where he exited early, to be fair to him, Worthy has averaged just 8.5 fantasy points in half PPR. That would make him wide receiver 47 over that time span. It gets even worse if you exclude that one lone ceiling game, which came in week 4 against Baltimore, his only double-digit fantasy performance of the season. And since Rice's return, Worthy has not finished in the top 40 at wide receiver. When you put it in that perspective, you have to start wondering if he's gone far beyond being a risky play and it just flat out is not start worthy, pun intended there. Now, to make matters worse, he now faces Denver. Pat Surtain has obviously been out with an injury, but Denver's defense has remained very stout, and their tougher coverage does tend to lean towards receivers with a higher ADOT, meaning that Worthy would likely see the tougher coverage, while Rashee Rice would have the clear edge. Given the number of trustworthy streaming options out there at wide receiver this week, Worthy is way too risky of a play this week. He should be benched for better options. With the trade of Jakobi Meyers, we expected Tre Tucker to step into being the wide receiver 1 of the Raiders offense, but our expectations were met with the complete opposite. The Jakobi Meyers trade opened up opportunities for specifically one person, Tyler Lockett. In his second game with the Raiders, Lockett's snaps increased significantly, and he led the receiving corps in receptions and targets. Now, this was against Denver, by the way, so it is possible that Tucker just drew the tougher coverage, and he could bounce back this week against a softer Dallas defense. Now, to be fair to Dallas, they did add multiple weapons at the trade deadline, but we have not seen what those weapons actually look like in their defense altogether, and we don't know how much those efforts have actually fix this broken defense. So assume an improved matchup here, and it does bring attention back to Tucker. However, again, last time we saw him have double-digit fantasy points was way back in week 6, so it was not just the matchup against Denver that was the problem. His targets have remained well below his early season usage, and since opening the year with 4 touchdowns in his first 3 games, Tucker has not scored since then. Tucker is an extremely risky play, but he is an intriguing one. While Pete Carroll's loyalty will potentially have him leaning heavily on Tyler Lockett here, given the matchup and the likelihood that the Raiders will be chasing points against a high-scoring Dallas offense that should take advantage of that Raiders defense, Tucker is a high upside play this week. Just be aware, his floor is legitimately 5 fantasy points. So the one thing that you should know about me above all, besides the fact that I am an awesome mom, is that I make it my personal goal not to fall subject to take lock. Now, take lock is where you have a tendency to stick way too hard hard to your guns on certain players and refuse to acquiesce, even when all the evidence in front of you says otherwise. I am not a flip-flopper, but I am not going to ignore potential just because it does not align with my point of view. I was very clear that I did not like Tyrone Tracy becoming the starter here and think that he was, untrustworthy because the Giants were going to operate in a committee and goal line work was going to go to Devin Singletary, but technically really just Jackson Dart there. And that is definitely what happened. But I am willing to reevaluate things with Jameis Winston at quarterback this week. Now, there is good news and bad news. Let's start off with the good news. Good news, Tyrone Tracy did reassert himself as the RB1. He had 14 carries for 71 yards last week. Unfortunately, he did not have much involvement as a receiver, which ultimately limits his upside. So he only had 8 fantasy points. Bad news here. Jameis Winston isn't exactly a check down king, so Tracy would likely need to succeed on the ground in this matchup. Now, good news. Jameis Winston's downfield aggressiveness should open things up for the run, and if they do get to the goal line, touchdown opportunities would go back to the running backs without Jackson Dart. Now, bad news again. The goal line carries would likely lean towards Devin Singletary. But good news. Good news here. Mike Kafka is clearly not beholden to Brian Dable's vision here, so it is entirely possible that Tyrone Tracy gets the bulk of the carries and goal line work here. Now, we don't love this matchup, but at least there's enough moving pieces that could mean Tracy is in line for a better day. I would rather risk it with Tracy rather than slumming it with Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt. So at this point, it is Thursday morning. We have zero evidence that Trey Benson is returning this week. Do not be shocked if Emari Demercado ends up having a top 30 week and double-digit fantasy points and perhaps a nice little ceiling game here. For 2 weeks in a row now, Emari Demercado has been the most productive Cardinals running back. The prior week, he did it through volume on the ground. This past week, he did it through big plays and receiving work. He had 4 carries for 64 yards and 3 receptions for 40 yards. Now, that last part might be the key there to why we would trust him this week because the Cardinals are very thin at wide receiver. Marvin Harrison Jr. has appendicitis and is out for the week. Now, for reference to people that roster Marvin Harrison Jr., don't panic there. That surgery really isn't that bad. I have had it. I would not expect him to be out for a long time here, but this week he is out. Zay Jones is out for the season. The Cardinals are obviously going to throw a ridiculous amount of targets to Trey McBride, but in the receiving core, they are staring down Michael Wilson and Greg Dortch. So Emari Demercado has been an extremely reliable receiver, and I would not be shocked if he saw an uptick in pass volume here this week. Bam Knight has also been dealing with an ankle injury, but his role has been minimized anyway. And then whatever affection that the Cardinals had for Michael Carter, I think that's gone at this point. He had 3 carries for 4 yards last week. The decrease in usage that we saw with Emari Demercado earlier in the season was related to that botched touchdown drop at the goal line there. They have clearly forgiven him. Emari Demercado is a legitimate RB2 this week for very needy fantasy managers. I mean, let's think about it. Would you rather go and get another 7 fantasy points from Kenneth Walker this week or shoot for a higher ceiling there with Demercado in PPR? The choice is not as difficult as you would think. Now, Christian Watson's return has been a bit underwhelming. He's had just 4 targets in each of his 3 games this season, no touchdowns. He's had between 6 and 11 fantasy points. I guess you could say that he is due, and this is the perfect matchup to be due because the Giants have been a complete mess on defense, and we finally did at least see a jump in Christian Watson's snap count last week, so we can assume that he is back to a more regular workload than he was in the first 2 games here. And last week against Philadelphia was just a bad matchup. And it's tough to put up numbers when Jordan Love hasn't thrown a touchdown since week 8. I am less concerned about Watson and more concerned if we can trust Jordan Love to put up numbers in this matchup. Now, Love has been incredibly inconsistent, and the Packers have leaned heavily on Josh Jacobs, but Love has shown multiple high upside games this season where he's thrown for volume and multiple touchdowns. Those big games have been against Washington, Dallas, and Pittsburgh. You notice a trend there, and the Giants do fit specifically into that category. We are also expecting more pass volume from the Giants we talked about with Jameis Winston at the helm. This really could be an excellent opportunity for a breakout game here for Christian Watson in 2025. If you need a high upside start flex this week, you could do a lot worse. Now, I talked very glowingly about Parker Washington in the waiver wire video this week, but starting him now does come with some inherent risk, unfortunately. Brian Thomas Jr. returned to practice, and Jacoby Myers should see an increased role this week in his second week with the team. And now Parker Washington is dealing with a hamstring injury. Now, however, obviously, Parker Washington has oddly enough been more reliable than Brian Thomas Jr. this year, despite not being the focal point of the offense for the majority of the season. In week 10, he stepped up with 3 receptions on 7 targets for 33 yards and a touchdown in one of the most difficult matchups of the season. He's become one of Trevor Lawrence's most reliable targets, and he has had a minimum of 7 targets in each of the past 3 games. This week's matchup against the Chargers is not ideal, but Parker does remain a interesting flex option and potentially safe play based purely on volume here. But you are right to be concerned that that volume might be spread out among a ton of recipients here. And I also forgot to mention that Brenton Strange could also return this week as well. There are 2 very clear scenarios here with Parker Washington this week. Brian Thomas Jr. may not play or potentially on a snap count limit, and that does make Washington an excellent flex option for us this week with top 30 appeal at the position. Now, scenario number 2 here is that Brian Thomas Jr. is cleared on Friday. There's no issues. He's going to play a full snap count. And because of Brian Thomas Jr.'s struggles, though, that would still make Washington a low-end flex option, but it would make him a little bit more risky here. The Jags have shown that they are very willing to make 3 wide receivers relevant, particularly in this scenario where they would likely be playing from behind. But in this scenario, again, you would easily lean on guys like Tez Johnson or Quentin Johnston over Washington here. And again, do not overreact, though. He is still a flex option. We saw Washington out-target Brian Thomas Jr. in the past 2 games prior to Brian Thomas Jr. being out there. So Washington is still a viable option here. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like the video and subscribe to my channel. And you can follow me across all social media platforms at It's Tara Time. So make sure that you are tuned in, locked in, subscribe, following, and turn on notifications because I'm bringing you more fantasy football content all season long. Every week I've got you covered with top waiver wire ads, stashes, live shows with Q&A where you can ask me anything you want, and so much more.